I appreciate Mario and Angela giving me a chance to come share some of the information that my organization has put together. As Angela mentioned, I work with a nonprofit disaster recovery organization called SBP. So we were founded in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. We work with families who have had their homes damaged or destroyed by a disaster and help them rebuild and be able to come back home. So we've been doing that around the country for the last decade, including up the road in San Marcos, working with a lot of families who were impacted by last year's flooding. And so over the course of that work, we've learned a lot from the organizations and the families that we've worked with about things that really have made a difference for them when it comes to being ready before something unexpected happens and being able to recover more quickly after. And so I talk a lot about disasters, sort of those big things, but it's also those everyday kind of things that could impact any of us, whether it's leaving something in the oven or on the stovetop that you forget about and come back and find you have smoke in your kitchen. Maybe you even have a break-in at your house. So all of the things that we talk about when it comes to being ready for the big things are very, very helpful when we think about being ready for those everyday kind of risks as well. It's especially important for people who work for organizations that provide critical services in the community. And so school districts are certainly one of them. And when you think about if there is some sort of disaster or emergency that affects the community, having schools open is a really important marker for the community to get back to normal. And so one of the things that's really important to my organization is not just encouraging the community at large to be prepared, but really having an opportunity to work with the organizations and institutions that play such a critical role in community recovery, and schools are one of them. So really appreciative of the chance to come in and work with Northeast on this. So what are we all doing at home, right? I think there's a lot of things that we could be thinking about that we could spend a little time on now so that if something does happen in the future, that we are in a better position to make sure that our family is safe, that our home is safe. And we were talking about finances earlier. There's a lot of things you can do to protect your financial future too that are really, really important. Whether it's a big disaster that makes the national news, whether it's something that just impacts your home, whether it's something that turned out to be a bigger disaster than we thought, like all the hail we had earlier in this year. There really are some things that can make a significant difference. I already mentioned a little bit about the organization that I work for, but we've worked with almost 1,200 families at this point in the last 10 years to rebuild homes. And so we have heard many of the same things over and over again from the families that we've worked with, and that's really the kinds of things that I want to talk about today. Sort of 5 areas that have really bubbled up in the communities that we've worked with about, I wish I had known this, I wish I had done this. And one is, what kind of risk do we face at our individual homes that we really should be thinking about, particularly flood risk, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, because it's really relevant here in San Antonio. Putting together a family emergency plan. So does anybody have one of those at home already? Okay, if you don't have one, I have a blank one for you that you will leave here today in here. And so I'll talk in a minute about some of the other things that we've got in here for you, but probably a good time to mention, we have a checklist and a resource guide. And so everything that I'm going to talk about today, already on this checklist. Usually when I work with schools and universities, they take notes, but most people don't. So I've already done the note taking for you. You don't need to do it. And anything that you're interested in doing on this checklist, you're going to find more information, resources, and tools on how to take some of those steps in the resource guide. So you'll have everything at your fingertips when you leave today, including a blank plan that you can sit down with your family and put together. Also going to talk a little bit about important documents. Not an exciting topic, but it is a really important one. Think about the last time that you went to the DMV to renew your license. If you didn't have a piece of paper that you needed to do that, how much of a painful process is that? It is infinitely more challenging if you're trying to file an insurance claim after something has happened to your home, or there's a disaster in the community, you're trying to apply for assistance and you don't have the paperwork you need. So talk a little bit about what some of those things are. Also going to talk about getting the right insurance coverage. So this is one of the most common challenges that the families that we work with have experienced. Many of them thought they were covered for something, and then there was a disaster in the community and they found out too late they weren't. And so it's really important to know what you're covered for right now, what your coverage options are, and based on the risks that you face, what might be a good idea for you to think about if you're not already sufficiently covered. I'll talk through what are the questions you want to ask your agent, so you can check that out. And then if you're a homeowner, there's some things that you can do to physically protect your home more effectively from high wind and water, and I'll talk about some of those options. Anybody had to deal with flooding or hail at their home in the past?
Hail.
So I know most of the the audiences that I've had a chance to work with here, hail has been a big, in fact, I work with a lot of companies too. Toyota lost the roof to one of their whole shops down there. So I mean, this is something that doesn't just impact individuals, it impacts organizations too. We'll talk about some of the things to think about. You can physically protect yourself from some things. Other things, financially is the best way to go from insurance. But just knowing what the options are is a really helpful thing. So what should we be doing now? This guy's kind of blue outside today. This is the right time to think about what could happen. When it's nice outside, when you have the time, when you're not in the middle of a crisis. Because if you find yourself in the middle of a crisis, it's often too late to do a lot of these things. So we want to think about them now. And first and foremost, what should we actually be planning for? Here in San Antonio, flooding, obviously one of the most significant concerns. It's a little bit hard to see up here, but all of those blue areas have at least a 1% chance of flooding every single year. It's a 100-year flood zone. When I do a lot of workshops, people often say, well, I live in a 100-year flood zone. We had a flood 5 years ago. I'm good for another 95 years. Yeah. If only it works that way, but unfortunately it does not. What it actually means is there's a 1% chance of flooding any year. You could have 300-year floods in a row. Yeah. Very, very possible. So important to understand that and to know how close you live in proximity to those flood zones, or if there are places that you travel or work on a regular basis. And you can see what the school district's floodplain looks like right there. High winds are also an issue here in San Antonio. And, I did a workshop where the city was also presenting, and a gentleman came in and said, we never have tornadoes, we never even have to think about it. And I was the next person up and I said, well, here's a map of damaging wind events and tornadoes in the last 10 years. That's what all those red dots and lines are. So it doesn't happen as often, but it's important to be aware that, it could happen, and it only takes once. And so it's good to know that that's something to keep in mind. But what you really want to know is not what could happen at a community level, but what could happen at your specific property. So one of the things that I really encourage people to do, and we have a link to it in the resource guide, and we'll send out a digital version so you don't have to type in any links. You can type in your zip code. It'll give you a list of hazards to think about at your particular area. Many of them you're probably already familiar with, but there may be one or two that you hadn't thought about yet. So it's really great to keep in mind when we talk about planning. And then also looking up flood risk at your address. Has anybody looked up their flood risk in the last 5 years? I really would encourage you to do this. Flooding is the most common and costly natural hazard that we face in the US. Really big challenge in this part of Texas. Even if you've never flooded in the past, doesn't mean that you may not have to deal with that in the future. And it's not just how close you live to one of those flood zones that we saw on the map, but think about how the landscape changes around you. If you live in an area where there's a lot of development and growth going on, if all the stormwater in your area used to drain across the street to that nice green space that now has a new apartment complex on it with a big parking lot, where's that water going to go now? So that's one of the big issues that the community dealt with in San Marcos. There's a new student housing development that went in across the street. The affordable housing neighborhood on the other side used to be fine. But because the stormwater couldn't go to where it used to go, 95 of 100 units in that development flooded. Most of them didn't have flood insurance. Never would have thought that they had needed it 2 years ago before that development came in. So important to think about how the landscape changes around you. And then of course the city has some good resources as well to think about, well, maybe I don't have high risk at my property, but I guarantee you drive somewhere in the city of San Antonio that has a potential to flood. I'm sure you've all tried to drive on the lower level of I-35 at some point after a rainstorm and figured out very quickly you can't get to where you want to go. So the City of Safe Route map system has identified all the dangerous low water crossings in the city. So if you haven't checked it out before, I would encourage you to do so. It's really helpful from a commuting or just other places that you go regularly if we know a storm's coming in. Where do we not want to drive? Because driving through flooded roadways is the #1 cause of fatalities in a flooding event, and a lot of times those are avoidable. So really want to encourage people to pay attention to that. And then after we've got a sense of what kind of risks we want to be planning for, where do we go so that we make sure we're plugged into the latest emergency information if there is something happening in the community? Has anybody signed up with Alert SA? So this is the city's emergency alert system. If there is some sort of emergency activity going on in the community, the city will use Alert SA to push out email, text, phone messages to let you know what's going on, so that if there's something that you need to do quickly to make sure that your family is safe, that you have that information at your fingertips. And the other thing I encourage people to do, if you're a smartphone user, anybody smartphone users? So FEMA and Red Cross have some pretty useful emergency apps. They'll let you know if there's severe weather going on. You'll get notifications to your phone. There's a lot of really good preparedness information. But what I like about both of them is that they let you track not just where you are right now, where you live, but also other locations. So I don't live in northeastern Ohio anymore. We were talking about that earlier. We get tornadoes up there. Not all that uncommon. My grandparents never go down the basement when we get a tornado warning. But I know they've gotten a tornado warning because I get an alert on my phone that says there's a tornado warning in your hometown, and I can call my grandparents and say, Grandma, turn off Downton Abbey or whatever you're watching on TV, and please go down the basement for at least the next 30 minutes. So it's kind of a funny thing, but it really can make a difference. And I will tell you, the number of stories that we as an organization have heard coming out of Katrina, coming out of Joplin tornado, that there are some family members that are only still with their family today because someone called them to say there's a tornado warning, or I'm going to come make sure you evacuate because there's something going on in the community. So the ability to not just take care of your immediate family, but to give someone you love a nudge if there's something going on in their area really can be life-saving. So it's a very useful thing to make sure that you keep an eye on. And the reason why it's so important is that if we get to the point where there is a warning that's issued in the community, meaning something is either about to happen or happening right now, we have to be in a position to act immediately to keep our family safe, whatever that is. So if we've taken the time ahead of time to put in a plan, to know where we're going to evacuate to, know how we're going to get in touch with our family, you're in a much better position to do that quickly than if you had waited till the last minute. So that's why we want to talk about it now when it's relatively nice outside, rather than to wait till, hey, we've got a tornado watch and this is something we need to be worried about. So that family emergency plan, really not difficult to put together, but there are 5 things that are really important to keep in mind. 1, what are the things that we should have on hand? So having some emergency supplies at home is a really helpful thing. And I'll talk about in just a minute what are some of the things you want to make sure that you have. 2, how are we going to communicate with each other? So without looking at your cell phone, how many people know all of the phone numbers for your immediate family members off the top of your head? At least a few people, but not everyone, because we don't have to dial them anymore, right? So I could tell you the house phone numbers of my childhood friends' parents, because those were the last phone numbers that I had to regularly dial. But if you ask me what my sister's phone number is, I have no idea, because it's saved in my phone. However, I have a card that I keep in my wallet with all of my family's emergency numbers, because think about what would happen if the power's out and your cell phone dies. You can't charge your cell phone. How are you going to get in touch with your family if something happens and you don't know that they're safe? So taking even something as simple as that, taking a couple of minutes now to make sure everybody's got those numbers. If you've got young kids, they've got them in their backpack, whatever that is, can save you a world of a headache down the road if something were to happen. So what are the numbers and how are we going to get in touch with people? Where are we going to go? So if you need to shelter in place at home, particularly if you have younger children or grandchildren, do they know what's the safest room in the house? If you need to evacuate in the neighborhood, maybe there's a house fire across the street. You don't want to stay where you're at, but you don't need to go too far. Or if you need to evacuate further out of the neighborhood because there's some larger event going on. So everybody know where you're going to meet, how you're going to get there. And then where to get the latest emergency information. So if something is happening, and we talked about what are those resources, and how to get assistance. So if you're impacted by some sort of emergency event, there's a lot of organizations here in San Antonio that might be able to provide some assistance. And I think you all should have a copy of that, but we do have a list of what some of those are. So it's good just to keep in mind and know who they are, how you can get a hold of them. All right, that disaster supplies kit. So you have this list in your resource guide. Pretty basic items, right? I think most people have many of these things, but making sure that you have enough of them is really important. If you're a pet owner, you want to think about not just what the humans in your family need, but the pets. Think about the amount of food and water that they need to go through if you were to have to shelter in place at home for 3 or 4 days. If anybody in your family takes daily medications, making sure that you have enough of those, at least a 7-day supply is usually a good idea. And if anybody in your family uses medical devices or equipment that require power, think about what you're going to do if the power's out for a few days. Are there manual backups? Do you have an alternative power source? You hope you never have to worry about that, but I can promise you that it makes a world of a difference if you do have someone that uses a medical device and you have made contingency plans in case you don't have power. And then it's always helpful to have some extra cash on hand. If there is something major that happens in the community, banks and ATMs may not be open, The stores that are open may only be able to accept cash. Gas stations may only be able to accept cash, so it's good to have a little bit on hand. Putting together that family emergency plan, like I mentioned, we have a blank one in here for you, and those are the key things that you want to make sure that you have in there. Contact information, your evacuation and sheltering information. You've got kind of a plan here that you can fill out. If anybody in your family has medical or access or functional needs, think about that, what that means for them. If you need to evacuate and someone uses a wheelchair, special planning that you need to do for that. If you own pets, not all emergency evacuation shelters allow for pets, just for health and safety reasons, so having a list of pet-friendly hotels. If you need to evacuate outside the city, a helpful thing to keep in mind as well. All right, paperwork. Not the most interesting subject, but it really is very, very important. We've got on the checklist a list of important documents to think about. And basically what you want to make sure is that the documents that say who you are, what your credentials are, that relate to anything that has to do with your house, anything that you own or owe money on, anything that has to do with your health and medical history, that you can access them even if you can't get home. So there are some hard copy documents like passports and things that you want to make sure you protect at home. This is a waterproof, fireproof chest this is actually mine, so this is what I have. You don't necessarily have to get one of these. You could do what my grandma does, put them in a Ziploc bag and put them in the freezer. Whatever it is, you want to make sure that you protect your important documents at home. I mean, we chuckle, but that's one of the few things that's most likely to survive a fire. You can scan them, have a digital copy that you keep on a password-protected flash drive at work, safe online storage, whatever that is. Just make sure that your physical documents at home are safe, and if you can't get home, that you can still get to copies elsewhere. Even send them to someone out of town, a family member. So lots of things that you can do, but you want to make sure that you can get to them. I'll tell you, we have a number of families that we've worked with over the years, and this is a challenge for a lot of them. We had a gentleman in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina who lost everything, down to the studs of his home. And he went to FEMA several times to apply for assistance, and every time that he went, they said, well, where's this document? Where's that document? He said, well, it's in the Gulf of Mexico with everything else that I own. And it was a little bit of dark humor, but it was true. I mean, you think about it, you don't have a birth certificate. That's usually the first thing people ask you for. If you have to go replace that and you have nothing else to prove who you are, how difficult is that on top of already dealing with the trauma of potentially losing everything you own? So you don't want to find yourself in that situation. You also want to make sure, while you're taking the time to go through that paperwork, that if you happen to inherit anything from a family member, whether it's a house, a vehicle, whatever that is, that the current owner's name is listed on that title. Because if something were to happen to that home or that vehicle, and you need to file an insurance claim, you need to get assistance, and it doesn't look like you own it, it's very, very difficult to get assistance. This is something that we are seeing up in San Marcos. It's something that we saw quite a bit in Louisiana and in many of the other places that we work. A lot of small towns, people have lived there forever. You know that this is this person's family's homestead. They've been there for ages. But that doesn't matter to the government or the insurance company if it's not your name on the title. So this is an important thing too. Getting the right insurance. So we know there were a few people who had to deal with the hailstorm earlier this year. Hopefully not the whole room, but I know it was a huge storm. That's generally a little bit easier to deal with because most insurance policies do include hail. That's not necessarily the case with every peril, and I'll talk about some of the things that are important to know when it comes to your policy in a moment. But before we even get to that, you need to know what you own, right? Has everyone done an inventory of your home or your apartment in the last couple years? You would be floored, just floored at the amount that you own. When you start going through all of your clothes, all of your books, all of your movies, everything that's in the kitchen, all of the furniture, all of your electronics, I mean, it just keeps adding up and adding up. And if you don't have a record of what you own, and for any reason, if it's damaged by fire or flooding, or even a burglary, which is what happened to my parents a couple of years ago, it's really hard to file an insurance claim or get assistance if you can't prove what you own. So an easy way to get started is literally to take your phone or video camera, open all of your cupboard doors, open all of your drawers, and go room to room and video what you own. Now, it's not going to tell you what everything is worth, but at least you have a pretty good starting record to say, this is generally what I own. Make your life so, so much easier. We worked with a woman in Joplin who was an insurance agent. About 30 of her clients had been impacted by the tornado back in 2011. And of those 30, one of them had photos of what he owned. The other 29, many of them had no home to go back to. And so for the next several months, they had to sit there and make a list of what they thought was in the house that they couldn't go back to. So think about how difficult that is for a family. Just so traumatic. So if we take some time now, well, I hope nobody ever experiences something like that. You don't ever have to worry about dealing with that kind of stress because you have a record of what you own. And for any big purchases, make sure you keep those receipts. Really, really important. It's a little bit of a pain, but it's important. It had nothing to do with the disaster at my home, but the airline just broke my suitcase on a previous trip. And the only reason I could get a claim and get money back for that is because I kept the receipt when I bought the suitcase. So even if it has nothing to do with your home, holding on to those receipts can certainly make a financial difference for you down the road. You also want to know what's in your insurance policy, what's in your home, what's in your policy. Anybody looked at their insurance policy in the last couple years? Really riveting reading, I know, very exciting. Really important to know what form of policy you have. So a named peril policy basically means you're covered for the types of perils that are specifically listed in your policy and nothing else. Or you may have a special or all risk policy, which means you're covered for any accidental causal loss except what is specifically listed in your policy. So important to know the difference. But even if you have one that says it's all risk, there are some things that are going to be excluded from just about every property insurance policy, whether you're a renter or a homeowner. Flooding being one of them. This is really, really important, particularly in the San Antonio area, to be aware of. So we have a list of questions that we've put together that you can sit down and you can actually ask your agent. So the next time that you talk to your insurance agent. And they really help you walk through, what do I need to know when it comes to perils, property coverage, values, other needs, and filing claims? What's in my policy? What's covered and excluded? Do I have insurance for flooding and other types of perils, because we looked at our risks earlier, the things that we might face? I spent a lot of time talking about flood insurance because this is the thing that we deal with the most, but it's also the most common thing that we see in the US when it comes to disasters. So I can't overemphasize enough how important it is to make sure you know what your flood risk is and if this is something you should be thinking about. It's not covered, as I said, in a standard homeowner or renter policy. If you live in one of those blue areas we looked at earlier, it's required if you have a federally backed or regulated mortgage, and you would know this already because they would have told you this. But even if you live in a low to moderate risk area, it's still a really good idea. So a quarter of all flood insurance claims actually come from outside high risk areas. And we work with a lot of families in Baton Rouge right now, over in South Carolina after last year's flooding events. They were told they didn't have to have flood insurance, and that was true because they lived across the street from a high risk area. But it would have been a really good idea for them. And so many of them had $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 worth of damage. They have to figure out how to pay for it now. And it doesn't take a lot of water to cause a lot of damage. So 1 inch of water could cost you $10,000 in your home. It's a lot of money for not a lot of water. And everybody has budget, so it's really important to think about, what makes sense for your family. And I'm not telling everyone to run out and get flood insurance. You want to know what actual risk do you face, and then is this something worth considering for you? A monthly flood insurance premium, well, their annual flood insurance premium for $100,000 worth of coverage for your contents and $250,000 worth of coverage for your home works out to something around $35 a month. If you don't have flood insurance, you have $50,000 worth of damage that you have to get a disaster assistance loan to pay for, and that's already a very low interest loan. That's a 30-year loan, is $240 a month. So think about the financial impact of that to a family. It's really important to know what's the cost, obviously, of some of these measures, but also what's the cost to you if you don't act. So I want to make sure people know what their options are because it really could make a difference for you down the road. When it comes to property, particularly if you're a homeowner, does your policy cover any detached structures on your property? And if you have anything like antiques, artwork, or jewelry, you need a separate policy for that because sometimes you do. So these are important questions you want to ask ahead of time. Are the values in your policy up to date? When was the last time you did take a look at what you own? Do you have enough coverage Sometimes there's a co-insurance penalty if you don't insure enough of the value of what you own, so you want to know what that is. Is your deductible in line with your needs? If you have multiple deductibles and there may be a situation where all of them are in force at once, does that still fit in with your budget? And are you insured to replacement value or actual cash value? Anybody know what they have in their policy right now? This is really, really important. I would really, really encourage you to check this out. So an example here, say you bought a really nice couch 5 years ago. Couch was $2,000 when you bought it. Today, maybe that couch is only worth $1,500. If you tried to buy a new one like it though, maybe it costs you $2,200. If you have replacement value and that couch is damaged by a covered peril, you get $2,200 to buy a new couch. If you have actual cash value, you're gonna get $1,500 because that's all that couch is worth. You can't buy a new couch for $1,500, so you're gonna have to front the extra $700 yourself. So think about what that means for an entire house worth of stuff. It can be a really, really big financial difference. So having a replacement value coverage does cost a little bit more, but often it's worth it if that increase fits in your budget. So at bare minimum, you wanna know what you can expect from your policy. So really encourage you to check that out too. Other needs, so sometimes policies have coverage if you need to rebuild and you have an older home. You're gonna have to meet new building code requirements and it can cover the cost of that increase. Or if you have to live somewhere else for an extended period of time while your home is being repaired, you have enough coverage for that. So important to check those out. And then if you have to file a claim, I hope you never have to, but if you do, you wanna know what they're gonna expect of you, how you're gonna do it. Do they have an app that you can use? I was at one of the local libraries a couple months ago and several neighbors were there, and one gentleman was telling me they were all impacted by the hail event. He was saying, well, I got on my phone and I was filing my claim while the hail was still hitting my roof. So he had someone out there the next day to take a look at his property. His neighbors, who waited less than 24 hours to finish filing their claim, 3 weeks before anybody got out there. So that's an extreme example, but it shows you that the quicker you can get your claim in, the quicker you can get someone out to help you. So knowing what the process is ahead of time is very, very helpful. And then physically protecting your home. So if you are a homeowner, there are some things that you can do at a bare minimum to make sure your home is well maintained and as storm-proof as you can make it. So we should definitely be inspecting our roof annually, especially before storm season, and keeping an eye on our property because there are some things that you can do to reduce those perils. So we actually have a checklist in here for inspecting your roof if you're a homeowner and inspecting your property. Of course, it's on the last 2 pages. We flipped all the way through the front to back before I got to it. But when we catch things while they're small, they're a whole lot less expensive to fix than if we find them down the road. I had someone that reached out to me back in, I want to say March. I had done a couple of workshops down at Toyota for some of their employees, and he said, Autumn, I finally got up on the roof and I realized one of my turbine vents was missing. So I had a hole in my roof that was about this big. And so he caught it. It didn't cost him anything to get up on that ladder. It didn't cost him a whole lot to replace the vent, but it would have cost him a lot of money had he not caught that before the storm that later came through and dumped a whole bunch of water on his house. So taking a little bit of time now to make sure that we're not missing something that's sort of preventative maintenance really can make a difference. And then if you're thinking about doing any home improvement projects down the road, maybe you have to get a new roof in the future, there are some great resources out there to give you information on the latest and greatest storm-resistant building and retrofitting techniques. FEMA's got a good set of resources, and the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, which is one of our partners, basically they have a lab where they test different kinds of construction practices to see what works well. I'm going to show you a quick video there, but I would just encourage you to check that out and see what they offer, because it might be something that's worthwhile for you. I guess the video is a little bit later, so we'll talk about that in a moment. And then, of course, checking your auto insurance policy. I know the low-cost insurance policies are very attractive for some people, but if you haven't actually read through your policy and you have one of those, people don't always realize that that doesn't cover you unless you have comprehensive coverage for things like hail and other natural disaster damage. So for anybody that had that during the hailstorm, they found out real quick they weren't covered for what they thought they were. And then, as I mentioned, protecting your home. So there are some things that I would encourage you to look at from an inspection standpoint and from a building standpoint. I'll show you one quick example here. So IBHS that has the lab where they test different kinds kinds of construction practices, this is just one example of one thing that in this particular instance made a pretty big difference. So they have this duplex, it's gonna get hit by high wind and water. It's gonna lose its roof cover. The only difference from one side of the duplex to the other is that those seams of that roof deck have been sealed. On the other side, they weren't. So the side where they weren't sealed, nothing to stop that water from coming in. So you're gonna see the electrical system is eventually gonna short circuit, the ceiling's gonna get waterlogged and the insulation's gonna start falling through. And not only do you have a mess when it comes to the structure of your home, but now the contents of your home are also getting damaged. In a minute, you're gonna flip over and you're gonna see the other side, where literally all they did was put the bitumen tape on the seams of that roof deck. Minimal damage on the inside of this home. They brought an insurance adjuster in to estimate difference in damage from one side to the other. $11,000. What did it cost to seal the roof seams on a house that size? About $500. So obviously everyone has different types of homes. You may already have a sealed roof deck. But if you don't, this is just one example of when we look at things like getting a new roof, asking our roofing contractor, how's my roof deck sealed? If I lose my roof cover, what's to prevent water from coming in? So thinking about some of those things, they can be a little bit of a financial investment, but they could also save you a ton of money down the road. So lots of things like this that I would encourage people to check out. And if you look at those resources that we have in the resource guide, they really provide you a lot of useful information. And then if something does happen, I hope it doesn't, but if something does, what should we do? Once your family is safe, your first step as quickly as you can is make sure that you can get in touch with your insurance agent. Get the ball rolling on whatever you need to do to file a claim. If it is a disaster where federal disaster assistance becomes available, and I'll talk about that in a second, you want to look at applying for whatever available assistance programs are relevant to you. And we do have some resources to help walk people through that because it can be a confusing process. We work with a lot of families who just, where do I even start? So we have some things to help get you started if you ever find yourself in a situation where you need that, and they're on our website. The other thing that we want to make sure people do is make informed decisions when it comes to making any repairs, remediating any mold issues that you may have, particularly in flood-prone areas, and rebuilding. One of the biggest things that we see, and certainly has happened in the state of Texas even after this last hailstorm, and something I know the Texas Department of Insurance cares a lot about, and we work with them, is dealing with issues of contractor fraud post-disaster. About 60% of all the families that we work with are victims of contractor fraud. You get a lot of people that come in, either do poor quality work or they're fly-by-night contractors who are taking advantage of people who have just been through a disaster. And so there's some good practices out there when it comes to working with contractors, even if it's just regular home renovation, you want to make sure you work through. And so we have some contractor fraud and contractor best practice guides that I would encourage people to check out. If for any reason there is a large-scale disaster, there may be a presidential disaster declaration which makes available some of the federal assistance programs that you hear about in the news. But it's important to know that there's no guarantee that that declaration is going to happen. And if it doesn't, those programs aren't available. And even if they are, federal disaster assistance was only ever designed to meet basic needs and get homes back to a safe, livable condition, never to replace everything that you lost, which is why it's so important that we think about preparedness ahead of time and we do our best to take care of ourselves. Because the government's not going to do everything for us. They may not even be able to do much at all. And if it's something like a house fire that just affects you, they've got nothing for you. So we need to be planning ahead of time for ourselves to make sure that whatever we can do now, we have done. But it's still helpful to know if there is a presidential disaster declaration, the kind of programs that could be out there. FEMA's Individuals and Households program, you can see the types of assistance that they may be able to provide, but they're going to ask you for all of this information, like we talked about before. So you got to have it, otherwise it's really hard to apply for it. The Small Business Administration also has low-interest long-term disaster loans available for homeowners. So you don't have to be a business owner, these are available to homeowners. Again, this is all they're going to ask you for though. And when we looked about those numbers earlier, this is still not as affordable as having insurance in the first place. So just important to be aware of that. If you want more information about disaster assistance programs, this is the website to check out. And then of course local organizations that may be able to provide support independent of whatever the federal government is doing. We have a list of those in the back. So that is really what I wanted to talk through this morning, into this afternoon, I guess. We're in this afternoon. What I would really encourage you to do, take some time when you have it, sooner rather than later. Look at the checklist, look at the resource guide with your family. Maybe while you're sitting down eating Christmas cookies, because it's not that much fun, but if you can get a little extra sugar, make things a little bit more enjoyable. I picked just one thing that you and your family can do together to start with. Because I can promise you, if you do that one thing, and something happens down the road, you will be very glad that you did whatever that was, because it will make a difference for you. I see this day in and day out. So pick one thing and start from there. And then the other thing I would ask you to do, the last document is a quick feedback form. We really appreciate feedback to see how helpful and how useful some of this information is to people that have a chance to sit in on workshops with us. But also, we check in with people 3 months down the road for anybody that's interested, just to see how things are going. What was useful to you? What do you need to be more prepared at home? So if that's something that you're willing to do, I would encourage you to jot your email address down on the bottom. We just send out a quick couple-minute survey. It's nothing too onerous. But we will also send you electronic forms, and I'll make sure Angela has them as well, of the resource guide and checklist. So if there are any links you do actually want to look at, you don't have to type them in. You can just click through. So I'll make sure that everybody gets those. So that's really what I wanted to talk through this morning. I know everybody has busy schedules, so I am here if you have any more questions. But thank you so much. Really appreciate your time and attention, and I hope you have a very, very wonderful holiday season.